Ok. Sì, va bene. Preferisci fare in piedi o seduto? O un po' seduto o un po' in piedi? Ok. Ok. Allora, oggi abbiamo il secondo seminario per il ciclo di seminari dell'Eurasia dal titolo Asian Community and Europe. Oggi come ospite abbiamo il professore Stefano Maria Evangelista, uno dei massimi esperti internazionali di letteratura vittoriana, letteratura comparata e cosmopolitismo letterario. Grazie alla collega, la professoressa Silvia Antosa, ha avuto l'occasione di invitarlo qui a Siena, quindi sono molto felice di questa opportunità. Il professore si occupa di letteratura inglese e comparata presso l'University of Oxford. Dopo aver conseguito il suo dottorato presso la stessa università con una tesi su Walter Pater e l'ellenismo romantico, ha intrapreso una carriera accademica di eccezionale rilievo, che lo ha portato a contribuire in modo significativo allo studio delle relazioni tra letteratura estetica e ricezione classica nel contesto europeo globale. Tra le sue pubblicazioni più importanti ricordiamo, mi fa piacere ricordare, Literary Cosmopolitanism in the English Fin de Siècle, Citizen of Nowhere, presso Oxford University Press, and British Aestheticism and Ancient Greece, opere che hanno profondamente influenzato il campo degli studi sul decadentismo e sull'estetismo. Ha inoltre curato numerosi volumi e fascicoli tematici su argomenti che spaziano dalla traduzione letteraria alla ricezione della cultura classica del modernismo europeo. Per la seconda parte vorrei lasciare la parola alla professoressa Silvia Antosa.
Ah, ok.
Per fare una cosa corale.
Sì, no, innanzitutto desidero ringraziare Stefano Evangelista per essere qui con noi oggi, voglio ringraziare Imsuk Jung e il centro CESC e il progetto insomma, dell'Eurasia per insomma, questo incontro è un primo momento di dialogo per le nostre discipline e macro aree e l'intento chiaramente è sempre quello di continuare a creare ponti, costruire momenti di dialogo interdisciplinare e di questo ringrazio tantissimo Stefano perché fa una ricerca, insomma, come avrete modo di sentire oggi, che sicuramente interseca tanti dei nostri percorsi di ricerca, percorsi di didattica, quindi parleremo sicuramente di diverse culture, della traduzione come ponte e di traduzioni non solo di testi, ma anche di immagini e di varie forme rese e scelte in qualche modo che poi si attualizzano sempre, no? Ogni scelta in qualche modo diventa poi anche una, come dire, un mettersi in gioco rispetto poi a quella che è la creazione di questi ponti dialogici. Grazie di cuore per essere qui e buona lezione. Diamo il benvenuto a Stefano Evangelista con un applauso.
Grazie mille delle due presentazioni, prima volta che mi è successo, un onore, felicissimo di essere qui, di avere l'opportunità di parlare con voi allora, due cose forse prima di iniziare, l'uno è che la lezione è in inglese. Va bene, perché qua è pronta in inglese, però ovviamente per la discussione, domande eccetera possiamo parlare italiano, inglese come preferite. Il secondo è che adesso partirò con questa lezione sul haiku, però spero di, cioè, ho in programma di fermarmi in più punti durante la lezione per chiedere se avete domande eccetera eccetera. Quindi come le professoresse hanno già spiegato, l'argomento è un po' un ponte fra la letteratura inglese e quella giapponese, anche fra la letteratura e le arti visive in un certo senso, quindi è un argomento in cui in fondo nessuno è particolarmente esperto, nel senso quindi non vi fate problemi se anche se avete domande che sembrano molto basilari, perché nulla è basilare. Quindi detto tutto ciò, parto. Allora, as a background to today's lecture. I just want to set out briefly the fact that probably many of you already know that the second half of the 19th century in Europe saw a real craze for Japanese culture. And that's because until 1853, Japan had been more or less closed to the rest of the world during the Tokugawa shogunate, in which period there were contacts between Japan and Europe, etc., but they were severely limited. After 1853, the date in which the Americans forced the Japanese to open to global trade, almost immediately and certainly very quickly, Japanese artifacts came to North America, but especially to Europe. I'm talking about textiles, porcelains, bronzes, and of course the Japanese colored prints, which were in many ways the most prized amongst artists and writers. All these artifacts were both incredibly beautiful and incredibly cheap at the time, which meant that they could be collected even by people who were not particularly rich, right? And that's why they had this kind of very wide reception amongst writers, etc., etc. Japanese art fascinated people in Europe because it was both incredibly new. It was something that people had not really seen before, but it was also very old because some of these objects that arrived were very old. So this mixture of the new and the old in this very peculiar combination is one of the things that we have to think about when we think of people looking at Japanese objects. In other words, the newness of Japanese art seemed to promise people new ways of kind of going beyond 19th century realism. So I want to get us started with a few images just to get us into this world. I should say, so 1853, an important date to remember, Japan is opened up. 1872 is another date I want to kind of pin down because 1872 is when the word Japonisme is first invented. It's invented by a French critic called Philippe Bourti. So he invents the word. Of course, Japonism exists before he invented the word Japonisme, but Japonisme is a very successful word, right? It's remained with us. So, can you see? Good. So our first image is a painting from 1872. So that's the same year when the word Japonisme, that's lovely, thank you. When the word Japonisme was invented, it's by a Belgian artist called Alfred Stevens, and this represents very much the kind of fascination for Japan. So it's called La Parisienne Japonaise, so the Japanese Parisian. So the fact that this woman can be both. Parisian obviously means sophisticated, right? That's the idea, that this is kind of somebody who's very fashionable, but also maybe a little bit kind of daring, she's kind of quite kind of confident in many ways with her sexuality, with her body, etc., etc. The Parisian attitude, right? But she does this through Japanese dress, right? She's wearing a Japanese kimono, she is holding a Japanese fan, and she also kind of seems to be, at the background, there is maybe a screen, something that recalls Japanese flower motifs. So the second image that I want to show you is by what is probably the most famous artist of the Japan craze within the English-speaking world, Whistler, American artist, but active in Paris. Caprice in purple and gold, the golden screen. Here, Whistler depicts one of his favorite models, who was also his lover, of course. And again, she is dressed in a Japanese kimono, but she is kind of, you can see behind her, there is a Japanese screen, and she's also holding Japanese prints, ukiyo-e prints, which you can also recognize from this kind of views of kind of very blue kind of images, right? So let me see what I've got next. Yeah, so in these images, you can see that what painters are doing, they're actually they're painting Japanese objects, right? So they're kind of almost giving us quotations of Japanese, as it were, by painting the objects. When we go a little bit further, and this is Whistler again, the same artist on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side of the slide, you have a print, a Japanese print by Hiroshige, so one of the kind of famous ukiyo-e artists from the 19th century. Here you see a different phase, a different type of kind of relationship. You can see that Whistler, who on the left-hand side is painting a picture of London, so Battersea Bridges is one of the bridges on the Thames, makes it look a little bit like it's a Japanese scene, right? So he's looking at the Hiroshige, and he's kind of composing the picture of London according to Japanese rules, if you will, of composition, right? So while the first the previous images that I showed you were much more basic in a way. They were basic images of artistic quotation. Here, it is something more than it becomes imitation. It becomes kind of giving the Western painter new eyes, new techniques, right? And obviously, because we're talking about translation, there's also a question of translation of medium. On the right-hand side, the Japanese prints, as prints were, it's made of ink on paper. Right, ink on paper. On the left-hand side, it's the most canonical form of Western painting, oil on canvas, right? So this is a translation, intermediate translation. And then I think finally, I've given you a couple of more famous images, a Van Gogh painting on the left. What you notice is, again, at the background of, this is a portrait, but behind this man, the background is entirely made up of Japanese prints that Van Gogh collected, right? And on the right-hand side, it's a painting of Émile Zola, one of the most famous writers from the fin de siècle, painted by Manet. And on the top right, you can see, well, I'll never be able to reach there, but you can see that on the top right, there is a Japanese print representing a kabuki actor on the top right. So what is, and you can't imagine that this actually says anything about Zola, right? Zola is a French writer, it's got nothing to do with Japan. Why is there a Japanese print? What does it mean? Why does a writer want to be painted together with the Japanese print at the time? It's very peculiar, but it kind of captures something that is in the air in the 1870s, 1880s. So I'll show you just quickly another Whistler, where the kind of references, if you will, to Japanese art become even more extreme. You can see how it's departing from realism. And then that's it. So in 1875, so around the time that these paintings were painted, Philippe Bourti, the writer that I mentioned before, the French critic who invented the word Japonisme, was asked to write a series of articles in the English press, in an English magazine, artistic magazine, about Japonisme, right? To present it as an idea to English readers. And here I have, as my first quotation, something that Bourti writes in English in one of these articles. I'll read it out for you. He says, so obviously what he's writing about is that what should we do? How can we kind of best use what we are learning from Japanese art, etc. And Bourti says, Europeans should, above all things, set to work to translate as literally as possible all the Japanese collections of celebrated poems, national songs, historical tales, tales for women and children, illustrated geographies, the descriptions of temples containing all kinds of curiosities, the popular and serious encyclopedias that they can lay their hands on. And such works are now to be found in considerable numbers in European libraries. This is the great thing to be done now. And it is a work as full of interest as the exploration of the sources of the Nile, leading as it does to the discovery of psychological regions hitherto very little known. So what Bourti is saying here, he's kind of diagnosing this state that we have towards these years, where Europeans seem to know a lot about Japanese art, or at least they thought that they knew a lot. Suddenly it had become incredibly familiar to them, but they knew next to nothing about Japanese literature. And so he's saying, the most urgent thing to do in order to kind of further this dialogue with Japan is to start translating. And you can see that his idea of translation is very, very eclectic. Like anything, from encyclopedias to tales for children, it doesn't matter what, he says, you have to translate a lot. Also because he says a lot of these books are already in Europe, which is true, because as part of this European acquisition of Japanese things, people even bought Japanese books, right? without being able to read them and kind of house them in libraries, etc., in collections. So this is very ideal. The truth is that in the late 19th century, very, very, very few Europeans had any linguistic knowledge to be able to carry out any translation from the Japanese. So, and in fact, Europeans will basically stay mostly ignorant about Japanese literature for several decades, right? And that's because the translation was very, very limited. And this will actually persist well into the 20th century. So this kind of dialogue, let's say, between the visual reception of Japan and the textual or literary reception of Japan is very important to what I'm going to be talking about today. So Burti himself mentioned one example here, and it's the woman in the middle of the slide. This woman is a French writer called Judith Gautier, who was the daughter of a very famous French writer called Théophile Gautier. And she was a pioneering translator from Chinese and Japanese. So on the left-hand side, you can see a book called the Livre de Jade, so the Book of Jade, or the Jade Book, translated by Judith Walter. That's a pseudonym, that's her. She invented this kind of name, of 1870-something, 72, and on 77, sorry. And on the right-hand side, you see the Livre de la Libellule, which is a translation of Japanese kind of a classical poetry, of a Japanese classical anthology from a few years later on, 1885. So what you can see here, so Gautier, I don't think actually she spoke a word of either Chinese or Japanese herself, but what she did is she worked together with Japanese and Chinese literary people who visited Paris or spent time there. And together with them, she collaborated on producing these very poetic and very, very free translations. And that's very common, I think, of these first waves of translations. They're very collaborative. They often only have the name of the Western translator on top, but in actual fact, they have an enormous input by Chinese, Japanese, etc. People so who have been kind of erased in many cases from the picture. Okay, so my talk today is going to explore this very first period of the arrival of Japanese literature into Western language. A period that, as even this slide shows, is very much in dialogue with the arrival of Japanese art. Because if you look at the image on the right, that's from within the book of Gautier, you can see that together with the translation, the book is very beautiful, actually. All pages are like that. They're very lavishly illustrated, right? Very lavishly illustrated, full of references to Japanese art, etc., etc. Because again, this kind of, the idea that the literature and the art kind of go together is something that is very important to what I'm going to talk about. And what I'm going to talk about is what is probably nowadays the most iconic form of Japanese poetry that I'm sure everybody's heard about, is the haiku. The haiku, right? Haiku poetry, I'm going to be talking about in a moment, but very, very short poems. So the first arrival of these poems. So it seems kind of almost impossible, right, to us to think of a time when nobody had ever heard of haiku, because this is probably the most globally famous form of Japanese poetry. I would go as far as to say it's one of probably the most globally famous forms of poetry altogether. Right, everybody knows it, and it exists in every language now. The end of the 19th century, people in the West had never heard of haiku. And in fact, what is even more important, they struggled to make sense of it, to understand what was beautiful about it, because it was so startlingly short and kind of did not speak to the poetic rules, to the poetic taste of people in the 19th century. So what I'm going to be trying to talk about is precisely this struggle of translators to make the haiku appealing to people in the West. So this is a kind of the most famous kind of haiku kind of writer, we could say, of the English poetic canon. This is Ezra Pound, an American writer from the beginning of the 20th century, who is normally regarded as the man who kind of naturalized, you could say, domesticated haiku poetry into English. And this particular poem, which was published in 1913, I think, 1913, called In a Station of the Metro, is normally kind of pinpointed as, you know, some people call it the first haiku in English. This is how it goes. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, right? You know, it's kind of super kind of essential. There isn't even a verb here. It's just an observation of something, right? Somehow, people got it. Like, you know, when this was published, you know, it was already kind of, the taste for this kind of poetry was already there. I'm not going to go as far as Pound today. So the people that I'm going to be talking about are people who did not have access to this kind of very modernist poetry. So they're people who are kind of writing in the 19th century, but want to kind of explain to people why poetry that looks like this is actually poetry and is actually interesting. So they face two challenges, translators from this time. One is they have to explain what to value, what is valuable about a haiku. And the second is how to translate it. You know, how do you translate this kind of very, very sparse, very essential kind of poetry? How do you make it sound like poetry? I'm going to be talking about these two characters, mostly. The one on the left is called Lafcadio Hearn. He's an Irish writer who emigrated to Japan in 1890 and spent the rest of his life there. He was just meant to go to write a series of articles, but actually he loved the country so much that he stayed. He married a Japanese woman and then kind of, you know, died there. On the right-hand side is a Japanese writer called Yone Noguchi who did the opposite. He's a Japanese writer who was born in Japan, but then emigrated to America and Europe, etc. And while Hearn wrote essays about Japan for Japanese culture for people in the West, especially English-speaking readers, but you know they were translated into all sorts of other languages, Yone Noguchi also did it, but kind of in a different way. He wrote in English, first of all, so he switched from Japanese to English. He's a bilingual writer, and he also wrote about Japan for kind of American English audiences. I'm going to be talking more about her than I'm going to be talking about Noguchi. So when I get to Noguchi, we're kind of almost done, as it were, in terms of the lecture. So first of all, though, before we look at some of this translation, I just wanted to lay down some of the characteristics of the haiku so that we're all on the same page. So what is their kind of very short introduction to haiku? First of all, it is a native Japanese form of poetry. That's kind of important because most Japanese poetry is actually of Chinese origin, and people are very conscious in the Japanese tradition that what they kind of do is kind of readapt Chinese form, whereas the haiku is widely considered as a native kind of authentically Japanese and uniquely Japanese form. What do they look like? Well, they have no rhyme. They are split into 3 units of 5-7-5 syllables. So it's a poem that consists of 17 syllables arranged with 5-7-5, and it has 2. It's normally kind of a poem about a direct observation of something, right? It's very concrete, like Pound does in the station in the metro. And it has 2 formal characteristics, critics normally say. So these 2 things are important. Characteristic 1 is that there has to be a cutting word or caesura, a point where, you know, kind of you change abruptly from one thing to another, which gives the poem a sense of fragmentation, but it also puts together different sensations, right? You know, so it gives it a richness, if you will, that's made out of a juxtaposition of things which are not expected. And the second formal characteristic is that there has to be a word which reminds one of seasonality, of time. This word is called kigo in Japanese, and it can be anywhere in this poem, but it has to evoke the season, so a specific time of the year. And by doing that, it also evokes the idea that time passes, right? You know, the sense of... and this seasonality is very important because it's also where the haiku is both very particular, So it's about a thing that happens only now, but it's also universal because it's kind of cyclical, right? So these are the two very important things. And the season word is also what makes haiku very often difficult to translate, because the season words kind of are very culturally specific, like they would be in any culture, right? So I don't know, like in Italy, you would think of, I don't know, of almond blossoms for, early April or something like that. But to Scandinavian, that doesn't mean anything, right? The same with Japanese. So these characteristics are expressed in what is probably the most famous haiku of all time, by the Japanese poet Matsuo Basho, and which I've given you here in a translation by the early 20th century British translator Reginald Blythe. So it goes: the old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. Right, this is probably the most iconic haiku. So the Japanese, the season word here is, so the old pond, a frog jumps in, caesura, the sound of water, right? Kind of this is where, kind of that's the cutting word, as it were, here rendered by the translator as a hyphen. There's nothing such thing in Japanese, right? It's unpunctuated, right? So the translator's punctuation is one of the things we're thinking about. And the season word is the frog, because frogs come out when it's rainy, so they come out during the rainy season, right? So, again, it's something that we don't, I at least don't frogs are not in my kind of sense of where the seasons are, but, it kind of culturally, this is where it's important, right? So this is one of the translations. There are hundreds and hundreds of translations of these poems worldwide. I would say probably it may even be one of the most widely translated poems like in the world, I would have thought. And I just wanted to give you as a reference this wonderful book. If you're interested in haiku, it's by Hiroaki Sato, and it's called 100 Frogs. And it's got 100 translations of this poem, which just shows you how something so small can translate in such radically different ways. There are two editions of this book, one with the translations, another one which is this one, which also has which also has introductory chapters to what haiku is, etc., which is a great source. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. So the question of brevity is also very important, right? As I say, it's something that translators struggle with. How can we kind of make sense of something that is so short? But it's something that is a little bit kind of deceptive, because in their original form, haiku were actually part of longer poem sequences, right? So they did not appear isolated like Ezra Pound does in his own poem. They were part of what is called chained verse, or chain verse, called renga in Japanese. That is, haiku were normally one in response to the other. Kind of a poet wrote the first one, and then another one, and then another that responded to each other, right? And very often, in fact, they were part of kind of games, sociability games. They were kind of composed during parties. They were often composed by different people, etc. So this whole kind of dialogic dimension is, of course, lost by the time that we see it isolated on the page. So the way that we see haiku now is also very different from the way that it would have kind of traditionally, right, in Japan, come into being. I'm kind of referring to here, without kind of doing so explicitly, to Adam Kern, who has written the introduction to the Penguin Book of Haiku, which is another very good source if you're interested in this form. One of the things that Kern, who's a critic, wants to do in this kind of big anthology of haiku is he wants us to kind of forget the idea that haiku is also very refined, that it's about a refined culture. And for this reason, he includes lots of poems which are comic or even vulgar, etc., to show that haiku can be written about all sorts of stuff, and well written about all sorts of stuff. So I've just given you a few examples here from his translation. So first one, marriage interview, sizing up each other's nose or lips, right? Second, pale moonlit night, in the mood to run off with a watermelon. Right. Third one, show benevolence and they will crap all over you, baby sparrows. Right, and there are some much more vulgar ones. Actually, there's a kind of whole session of very kind of vulgar, kind of very sexual haiku as well, which is very interesting, right? So to kind of get the sense of the range. That's not the kind of things that our Victorian friends were translating, obviously, but that's the kind of thing that does exist, right? It's a wider genre. The other thing that is important about haiku, and this Kern also points it out, is that while I'm kind of saying about the end of the 19th century and how this genre had to be kind of, in a way, invented in Europe, right? To make it palatable to Europeans. The same was true also of Japan. In the end of the 19th century, also within Japan, there was an enormous shift in the way that people understood haiku, how they valued it, right? And that's down to a Japanese critic who is called Masaoka Shiki. And there should be something, yeah, that's right. It's down on my next slide. So Shiki was a scholar, was very interested in haiku. And very interestingly, Shiki actually also translated haiku into English himself. He revived this poetic genre, but he revived it as a cosmopolitan, cultured Japanese of the end of the 19th century would. Shiki was somebody who was very familiar with European literatures. As I said, he was kind of so good that he was actually able to translate into English, right, out of Japanese into English. Very difficult thing to do. And he, in kind of reinventing the haiku as a modern form, he took inspiration partly from European literature. So he is the one who was first really insisting that haiku should be understood in isolation. So they were kind of he kind of was one of the ones behind the idea of repurposing the haiku as a standalone poem, which kind of emphasizes ideas of individuality, etc., which are actually much more typical of Western lyric poetry. And as I said before, is not something that was part of the haiku tradition originally. So you get this very interesting, I think, sense of cultural exchange and contamination around this time, where within Japan, ideas of Western poetry, which are kind of coming in, because just as Europe is kind of thirsty for knowledge of Japan, Japan is thirsty for knowledge that comes from the West. So they're studying Western poetry a lot in Japan, Western literature, and that is influencing the way that they understand their own traditional literature. And at the same time, Japanese literature is very slowly, for the first time, kind of arriving into Europe there. The quotation here from Adam Kern is that Shiki streamlined a jumble of pre-modern verse practices into a single poetic form as a national emblem, when those practices had in their own day never been conceived of so monolithically, let alone in terms of a modern nation state that had yet to be invented. So what Kern is saying is that Shiki kind of not only kind of had this influence in kind of reconceptualizing the haiku, but also kind of nationalized the haiku, kind of turned it into something that, kind of he really played on that idea that I talked before, that this is a form of poetry that is actually natively Japanese, is not Chinese, it's not something that comes from abroad. Okay, so does anybody have any questions for now before I launch into my first example? Everybody's happy? What the haiku is? Very good. Good. All right, let me see the time. We're fine. Okay, so at the bottom here, you have a little triptych of prints from the early 20th century, which show a kind of modernized Japan with kind of trains, etc. This modernized Japan is the world in which Lafcadio Hearn arrived in 1890. So you remember him, our Irish friend. As I say, he arrived in Japan in 1890 and started writing about the country. Here you have him so I've made a little slide with different kind of images of him. The first on the left is what let's say a Western portrait. I should note, which perhaps is strange, Hearn is always kind of photographed like this in profile because he actually had an accident that disfigured his right eye. So he doesn't kind of, you don't normally see him showing it. That's also why the other eye looks like it's very, very open. It's because he couldn't actually see from the other, so the other one was bulging out to compensate. So this is him in Western dress, this is him in Japanese dress, and the other one is with his wife, Setsuko, and his firstborn of 4 children. The Hearn family are still very much around in Japan, and kind of, and I should say that while to us in the English-speaking world, Hearn is not a particularly famous writer, in Japan he is completely and utterly well known. Like, everybody knows who Lafcadio Hearn is. In fact, Hearn became a Japanese citizen in 1896. I think he took on Japanese nationality. That's very, very rare, because it also at the time involved the fact that you had to give up your British nationality. He was Irish, but British because British Empire, right? At the time. He gave up his British nationality. He also took on a Japanese name, as you did at the time. So in Japan, he's known as Koizumi Yakumo. That's his name in Japanese. That's the name through which they know him still today. And on the right-hand side, it's a photograph that I took myself. That's why it's not very good. It's one of the many sites that are dotted around Japan that remember, for example, Lafcadio Hearn slept in this hotel, or Lafcadio. So it's that famous that they actually they memorialize. This is particularly so. It's in a hotel where he stayed for a few nights. So this is him, and in the next slides I put down some of his books from the time. Some of them have got very beautiful coverings. You can see again how the editors are playing with that kind of sense of Japanese art, and how they are kind of using them to reference, to kind of sell, as it were, Hearn's works. Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan on the left-hand side was his first work about Japan, and then he wrote about 7, 8 books about Japanese things. He's particularly well known for his ghost stories. So Hearn wrote about Japanese ghost stories. And that's the important thing, that Hearn was not kind of self-consciously, or he did not advertise himself as a translator, but actually a lot of what he writes about are actually translations from Japanese folklore and oral literature, which again he did together with Japanese people whose names are not recorded in these books very often. His wife was one of them. She collaborated in many of his books, and some of his students, because Hearn taught English in Japan. He was the first professor of English at the University of Tokyo. So he kind of got them to do a lot of work for him, and then together with them, he translated and published. Hearn never published explicitly about haiku, right? None of his essays or anything like that is entitled haiku. There is no such thing. But actually, Hearn is without doubt the most prolific translator of haiku into English at the time, and the most pioneering one. Is the first one who engages with the form at such length. So in the 1899 book In Ghostly Japan, the one with the flower branch, the kind of plum blossom probably branch on the in the slide, Hearn includes an essay called Bits of Poetry, which provides a remarkable introduction to the haiku in English without ever once mentioning it by name. So he doesn't kind of even use this name at all. And here I have a slightly long quotation, which in which Hearn does what I said at the beginning, tries to explain kind of how does this poem work, how does the type of poetry actually work. And here it goes. The common art principle of the class of poems under present consideration is identical with the common principle of Japanese pictorial illustration. By the use of a few chosen words, the composer of a short poem endeavors to do exactly what the painter endeavors to do with a few strokes of the brush: to evoke an image or mood, to revive a sensation or an emotion. And the accomplishment of this purpose by poet or by picture maker depends altogether upon capacity to suggest, and only to suggest. A Japanese artist would be condemned for attempting elaboration of detail in a sketch intended to recreate the memory of some landscape seen through the blue haze of a spring morning or under the great blonde light of an autumn afternoon. Not only would he be false to the traditions of his art, he would necessarily defeat his own end thereby. In the same way, a poet would be condemned for attempting any completeness of utterance in a very short poem. His object should be only to stir imagination without satisfying it. So that's, I think, a very nice and comprehensive quotation. And the things I want to highlight for you are the following. First of all is the emphasis on suggestion and incompleteness, right? This is what I was saying to you before about the fragmented nature, the fragment nature of haiku poetry, right? You know, kind of, it's not to do with kind of trying to define something fully, but to capture something that cannot be ultimately defined. That's why kind of the kind of sense of and the idea that kind of that it is about suggestion, suggesting a mood, suggesting something, not kind of explaining it. The second thing that comes up very strongly here, and I think is important, is how is the presence of Japonism, right? That we talked about at the beginning, the visual. So Hearn knows that readers in Europe and in America are going to be familiar with Japonism, with Japanese art, as kind of used also by Western painters, etc. So when he tries to explain how the poem works, he's comparing it to the painting all the time. This is, it's a very weird thing to do if you think about it. To try and define a poetic form by kind of going back to some art that doesn't have anything to do with it, actually, ultimately. So there is this kind of sense of verbal visual dialogue. And the result of this is kind of that haiku it kind of comes into being in the West as this kind of hybrid form in which the visual and especially the pictorial is always kind of present. So I want to just give you another quote from here, very short, in which Hearn goes on to say, poetry in Japan is universal as the air. Universal as the air. It is felt by everybody. It is read by everybody. It is composed by almost everybody, irrespective of class and condition. Nor is it ubiquitous in the mental atmosphere only. It is everywhere to be heard by the ear and seen by the eye. Seen by the eye. Again, the idea that poetry you see, right? Very, very strange, if you will, idea. And that's how he's trying to get his readers to get into the frame of mind of what they have to understand. I mean, needless to say, there is an element of Orientalism very strong, right, in Hearn, like, kind of idealization, if you will, even objectification of Japan in here. But what I like is that kind of idea of everybody, right? Again, he's demystifying the idea that poetry is something that belongs to a literary elite, and he wants the readers in the West to think that poetry is a kind of democratic, you could say, almost democratic art in Japan, And so he goes on to give all sorts of examples. Let me see if I got another one. Yeah, where he's kind of talking about what does it mean to have visible poetry, right? So he kind of explains a little bit more here, and he says, as for visible poetry, it appears everywhere. He says, in houses of the better class, there are usually a number of gaku or suspended tablets to be seen, each bearing for all to see a beautiful written verse. So that's a domestic setting. But poems can be found upon almost any kind of domestic utensil, for example, upon braziers, iron kettles, vases, wooden trays, lacquerware, porcelains, chopsticks of the finest sort, even toothpicks, right? Poems are painted upon shop signs, panels, screens, and fans. Poems are printed upon towels, draperies, curtains, kerchiefs, silk linings, and women's crepe silk underwear. Totally bizarre, right? We get this country where there's poetry on toothpick, on underwear, kind of it's a little bit strange, of course, what he's doing. It's obviously kind of playing a little bit, but kind of also demystifying the idea of poetry as something kind of precious, if you will. So what is he trying to do? So he's trying to do a series of things. First of all, he's trying to introduce the very foreign notion to Western readers at this time that a poem can be looked at in its completeness at a glance, right? That's something that normally does not happen with a Western poem, which is linked to the medium of the book, and therefore the turning of pages, etc., etc. In Hearn, it's like a picture. A poem is like on a sheet of paper. It can be kind of got in one sitting, in a moment, right? That's one thing. So he's trying to kind of explain this sense of miniature that I had in my title, right? The miniaturization of poetry. And then he is also kind of by associating poetry to all these objects of popular culture that are in the home and kind of a very unfussy, unpretentious objects. He is linking the idea of poetry, or the beauty of poetry, with the ephemeral, something that kind of doesn't stay, can be thrown away, right? Kind of not a culture of memorialization, but of kind of passing of time, kind of moving on, blah blah blah. So Hearn, I should say, this very sympathetic appreciation of the haiku was very unusual at the time. He was not the only Western or English-speaking writer who kind of engaged with haiku poetry, but the judgments of most of his contemporaries were generally negative. So what I've given you here, as a way of, by comparison, is what was then a much more kind of well-respected and academic source than Hearn's writings were. So this is the kind of thing that kind of serious people would be reading, right? This is a history of Japanese literature, a pioneering work from 1899 by somebody called W.G. Aston. And this is what he says about the haiku. He says, it would be absurd to put forward any serious claim on behalf of the haikai, or haiku is the same thing, to an important position in literature. To the English reader, this will appear bold and even meaningless, he says. But to an inhabitant of Edo, Tokyo, it conveys more than meets the ear. So you see, it's incredibly dismissive. It would be absurd to put forward any claim of seriousness. Aston gives the impression that these are not only kind of valueless poems, but are kind of untranslatable poems. So he says, while the Japanese might get something out of it, the inhabitants of Edo, right? The people who are in Tokyo would understand. You can't even start trying to translate this for the West because it's just too much. People don't understand. People would never be able to understand. And what he means by that is that the other thing about haiku is that they are very often very highly intertextual forms of writing, actually. Because as I said before, they tend to respond to one another, right? They tend to respond to one another, so that it is important to know about one to be able to understand another. And this knowledge, Western readers just don't have this type of knowledge. And therefore, it is impossible to kind of make them appreciate what's going on in there. Blah, 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 blah. Hearn also, in his own translation or in his own writings about haiku, very often talks about the problem of the untranslatability, of just how difficult it is to translate haiku. But this is not something that stops him, right? He kind of says this is very difficult to translate, but then he goes on to translate, in some cases, hundreds of them in his essays. And so what I've given you here is a page from the same essay in the book In Ghostly Japan, which gives you a flavor of how it is that he translates them. Right? So Hearn doesn't do the blank page approach. So he doesn't give you the poem in the middle of a page, right? Kind of giving it its kind of significance. What he does is that he embeds it, he kind of puts it inside the texture of his essay. So he's writing an essay, and then what is typical here, he kind of gives you the transliterated haiku first, so the Japanese kind of transliterated into English, and then he gives you a translation embedded in his own text, which is horizontal. So not a vertical translation, but a horizontal translation. And here, so he gives you the Japanese. Why? I mean, he's not expecting your readers to understand the Japanese, obviously, but he thinks, obviously, that the sound is so important that he's going to use all that page, all that space on the page, and kind of remember that space on the page costs, and editors hate using, kind of journals hate kind of giving you all that blank space for nothing, effectively, because he thinks that the sound is so incredibly important. And then he gives you the transliterated thing, which is just after the quotation. Translated, this would appear to mean only 2 butterflies. Last year, my dear wife died. Right? So he gives you quite a literal translation, and very often then he goes on to explain what this means, right? To kind of elaborate on what that means. So in effect, there are almost, you could say, 3 levels of translation in something like this. The transliteration into Roman script, which is already a form of translation, right? From the Japanese alphabet to the Roman script, and then a literal translation, very kind of close to the Japanese, if you will, and then an explanation, which is another form of translation, right? A kind of free explanation. So you could see Aston, the professor, the critic type, was kind of saying, you just can't translate this. Hearn is finding an ingenious way of kind of doing a triple translation on the page. So yeah. And this is, again, a couple of pages from another essay, from the same essay, Bits of Poetry in Ghostly Japan, in which you can see how often he's interpolating haiku, etc. The last one there, I just wanted to point out to you, because it was from an 18th century woman, female poet called Chiyo of Kaga, or Kaga no Chiyo in Japanese, whom Hearn was interested in. He translated her poetry several times, and the haiku again is associated to a visual image. You can see those, and the poem goes like this. Hearn writes, having been challenged to make a poem of 17 syllables referring to a square, a triangle, and a circle. So square, triangle, and a circle. So you see the game, poetic game, right? Chiyo is said to have immediately responded, quote, detaching one corner of the mosquito net, lo, I behold the moon. So you have the square of the mosquito net, it's folded, and the round of the moon behind. So Chiyo, an extremely important poet of the haiku tradition, this same woman, had recently made an appearance in English, actually, in a translation from 1895 by this other important early translator called Edwin Arnold, in this book called The 10th Muse and Other Poems. The 10th Muse and Other Poems, which was pretty typical of the time in that it mixed Japanese poetry, in this case, with Persian poetry and with his own original poetry in a kind of complete mishmash, right, of everything. This is the translation of one of the poems. So he has only one poem by Chiyo, and this is how he goes. My chaser of the dragonflies at play, oh my son, I wonder where the little feet today have run, right? So I've given you this because this is also a haiku. So it would have looked like, 3 lines, and all the work that Edwin Arnold is doing to make this look like a more recognizable poet in the poem in the English language. So it's rhymed, play, day, sun, run, complete complete departure from the Japanese. And of course the repetition, again, completely alien, have run, oh, my son. So it's kind of trying to evoke that sense of loss, right? And it's doing it by kind of using poetic devices which are completely kind of alien from the original. So very, very different set of techniques, etc. What's also remarkable is that he kind of actually misattributes the poem. There are kind of lots of mistakes, let's say, in just a short poem like this. Anyway, so let me just give you. I have a couple more images to show you just how many haiku Hearns kind of puts into his translations, into his essays. So the first one. Old temple, bell voiceless, cherry flowers fall. See how he's kind of really making no concession to what we would expect to be poetic. The one concession that he makes is that he gives it titles. Lonesomeness, for example, that, haiku don't have titles. So he's kind of using that convention to kind of mediate. The other one, morning awakening after a night's rest in a temple, he calls it. So he kind of gives you a context, right, in which to understand. And it goes, in the mountain temple, the paper mosquito curtain is lightened by the dawn, sound of waterfall. And then winter scene, snow village, cocks crowing, white dawn. Right, super, super minimal in what he's doing. Hearn wants, so he's trying to do, so while as we've seen the previous writer, Arnold, wants to domesticate the haiku in English, wants to make it sound like, something that we're familiar with. Hearn is doing the opposite. He wants it to make it sound like something that we're not familiar with, something new, completely new. Yeah, and so I've also given you his own version of the famous frog haiku by Basho. This is Hearn's translation goes, old pond, frogs jumped in, sound of water, right? Again, very, very simple. And what you get is the hyphens here, right? So he's using these hyphens to create that sense of rapture, kind of moving on from an image to another. By contrast with that, I've given you a translation by Norman Page, a translator from the early 20th century, a very canonical translator, by the way, of Japanese literature into English, which goes like this. A lonely pond in age-old stillness sleeps, apart, unstirred by sound or motion, till suddenly into it a lithe frog leaps. Right, here it is in kind of dactyls, kind of very, very kind of recognizable Western English poetic diction, like a proper poem, right? So just to kind of contrast, the incredibly different worlds in which people were moving at the time. Any questions? Anything that people want to kind of pick up before I go on, or ask, or point out? Let me see how we're doing for time. All right. Yes, please.
Looking at how different these two look, but of course the
yes.
Hearn's one is much closer.
Yeah.
Which type of translation was most successful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it depends also what we mean by successful. So Norman Page is somebody who is very highly regarded as a translator of Japanese literature, whereas I don't think that Hearn would be very highly regarded as a translator of Japanese literature. And this is partly because, as I said, he never published a book of haiku. His haikus, you got to go and find them inside the essays, right? So he's not linked to, we don't remember him as a haiku translator or as a poetry translator, whereas Norman Page, we do. So in many ways, Page was more successful, but Hearn, I think, was more experimental, and I think it's not uncontroversial to say that from our point of view, Hearn's translations sound much more successful. Like, they capture something that you think the original is like, even if you don't read Japanese. Right? Because I think we are more used to the idea that we can find it beautiful or meaningful, right? We get it, even if it's so sparse, we're now also familiar in a way with it that we can get it. We can get where it's beautiful, where it's poetic, whatever. Whereas we find the barockery of Norman Page a little bit like old-fashioned, right? Yeah, it kind of sounds like a bad poem, effectively, right? Yeah. So it's interesting that they've aged in very, very different way. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, I'll move on then. Let's see what I've got, because I've kind of, so look, I've given you some more. So this is a slide with nice early translations of the same poem, the frog poem. So Masaoka Shiki, so the Japanese critic translating out of Japanese into English. The old mere, a frog jumping in, the sound of water. Right, good. We like this one. I think, kind of we get what he's doing. I would just point out to you, no full stop at the end. I don't know if it's just a kind of misprint. I hope not. I think it was something that he kind of maybe was intentional. But see how he is using the exclamation mark, right? As something that, a device to kind of to create that sense of disruption, of kind of startling vision, right? Kind of that kind of is using punctuation. You were counting the old Mia. No, so it doesn't use the type of the amount of syllables of the Japanese. Aston we've seen before. He's the one who says it's impossible to translate the haiku in English and its poems have no value. But then he does. And he says, an ancient pond with the sound from the water of the frog as it plunges in. Basil Hall Chamberlain, British professor of Japanese philology at the University of Tokyo and friend of Lafcadio Hearn, biggest Japanologist of the end of the 19th century in the English tradition. He translates, the old pond, and the sound of a frog leaping into the water. I see some heads shaking. I don't know. The eye is, it kind of gets the sense of drama, I suppose, right? That you're surprised. And then Clara Walsh, early 20th century translator that I've just kind of found Googling online. I found it actually from the 100 Frogs kind of anthology. Clara Walsh is interesting because we know nothing about her. She's one of these kind of typical of women writers at the time who are kind of translators mostly. But her name kind of keeps cropping up, but there is no article, nothing written about her. Who is she? She's probably the daughter of an aristocratic family. Anyway, she must have got interested in Japan. Did she speak Japanese? Who knows? Anyway, this is the haiku. An old-time pond, from off whose shadowed depth is heard the splash where some lithe frog leaps in. Again, much more kind of familiar use of kind of a typical accentuation, right, of European poetry, English poetry. So a lot of these frogs. So this is Lafcadio Hearn's essay on frogs. He's got a whole essay on frogs, which I've kind of given you here. I'm not going to read it out, but just to give you another, to let you have another look at what this stuff looks on the page of Lafcadio Hearn. So on the right-hand side, you can see another example of that kind of set, kind of this kind of transliterated poem, kind of speaking Japanese almost, right? In the middle of the English there, followed by the English translation horizontal, so not vertical, horizontal haiku, and the English translation goes, with hands resting on the grounds, reverently you repeat your poem, O frog, O frog, right? This is Hearn's translation. But what you get also is that you have, as an epigraph from the poem, you have another haiku at the beginning, right? So it's kind of using it in kind of lots of, again, interesting ways. I often, when I talk about this, I talk about his pages being fussy or messy. And that's the truth. And that's part of the reason why he's not famous as a translator, because that kind of, there's a lot of mess on this page, right? To extract this, it kind of takes quite a lot of reading, right? It's not systematic. And certainly does not believe in the blank page kind of approach. Not at all. It's cluttered, Hearn. Yeah. So let me just, I'm not going to read this, but, just again to give you an idea, this is an essay, this is also the essay on frogs, of just how many translations there are, right? Kind of in some essays there are hundreds of haiku. This is the 1890, early 19th century, where otherwise they are not kind of translated into English at all. And here, another collection called Koto, there's an essay on fireflies. So Hearn loved insects, and he loved the way that the Japanese kind of were interested in insects, and he writes about several essays about insects in Japan. And in the essay on fireflies, it's another essay which is full of haiku translations. And this, I gave you this because it's the same poet as before, Chiyo of Kaga no Chiyo. It's the same female poet that I've given you before. And this is a kind of print that illustrates her. With her most famous poem is about a morning glory. So it's about a plant, and so she's kind of put against that plant as an iconic gesture, and Hearn's translation of this particular haiku by Chiyo is it the river only, or is it the darkness itself drifting, oh the fireflies. Because the fireflies, as you know, kind of they just are lit for a moment, right? They're lit for a moment, and I think there's something to do with fireflies and haiku, which also Hearn is kind of suggesting here, because like fireflies, haiku are very momentary, like they light for a moment, they're kind of quick, and then they disappear. So it's a similar type of. So he's making the point that in a way insects are particularly good subjects for haiku, because they also are these kind of little things that you don't otherwise notice, but they actually have very complex, very kind of attractive, very weird things that he loves. Okay. Let me have a look at what my next slide is about. It's about fireflies. So you see the essay on fireflies. There's another one essay with tons and tons and tons of haiku. The lost child, though crying and crying, still he catches fireflies. The one underneath, out of the blackness, black people call fireflies. This is about people who go and pick them up at night. Having heard the voices of people, the firefly now flies higher, etc., etc., etc. See how he's also using those square brackets to kind of give you extra context here. His translations are, if you will, very prosaic, but in a way that prosaic has become more poetical to us. Blah, blah. We're not going to go into this, but there are tons. And this is just an image of a Japanese illustration of fireflies catchers. So people who catch fireflies, on the left-hand side, you can see there's a little boy who has a little cage of where people collect fireflies. Hearn even tells the story that in the end of the 19th century, fireflies were popular in restaurants in the summer. So some restaurants would kind of have baskets of fireflies, which they would release at some point in the middle of the night, so that they would go and people would just enjoy the spectacles of fireflies in the middle of their meal, and etc. So he's kind of really kind of, so you get the picture what he does. Like, he kind of gives you the poetry, but within this texture of trying to give a more kind of, you could say, a more organic picture of Japanese culture. So the Japanese culture of fireflies, and how the haiku kind of he's using this to give you the evidence, right? The poetic evidence of a culture that is lived, almost anthropological and poetic at the same time, you could say. Okay, let's have a look at this, and then I think last slide on Hearn, and then I will move on to Noguchi. So this is an anthology that appeared in, I think it's 1914. I can't see my notes, but I think it is 1914. Anyway, after Hearn died. Hearn died in 1904. So this is, they made an anthology of some of his writings, where they extracted the poems and put them and anthologized them. And you can see, so these are all translations by Hearn, but kind of done, as I say, 10 years after he died. With that, whoever did the anthology, they did it well, because they preserved that principle. On the left-hand side of the page, they put the vertical, you could say, haiku, kind of in transliteration, so sound. On the right-hand side, they put Hearn's translation in his kind of characteristic kind of horizontal way. And this is what they say. So this is a collection of Japanese lyrics translated by Lafcadio Hearn, 1914. So kind of a stress after he died. The editor says, scattered through these pages of Lafcadio Hearn's writings are many Japanese lyrics. So graceful are these little poems, so characteristic in their swift, sure impressionism of Oriental art, see, again, this weird kind of reference to the visual, that it has seemed worthwhile to bring them together within the compass of a single volume. In their limitation of a poem to the representation of a single impression, and their ability to present that impression with the utmost vividness and with the sternest economy of words, these Japanese poets are strangely akin to the imagists, the youngest of the modern schools. And for this reason, it has seemed particularly appropriate that their work should be included in the new poetry series. Right? What's obviously startling here is that Hearn himself had never heard of the images. Like, he died before this happened. And so these people, though, are saying, oh, look, he's writing something, he's translating something that really looks like contemporary poetry. So, and then again, I'm going back to that idea that I introduced at the beginning of Japan being at the same time very new and very old. This kind of strange mixture, and that's the same. So this is ancient poetry, right? This is poetry from the 16th century, 17th century in many cases. Basho is a 17th century poet, but it's presented as being super contemporary. This is just like the images, which is like, last year's poets, right? It's a very avant-garde. So old and new at the same time. Okay. Second example. As I say, this is much shorter, so don't despair. Yone Noguchi. Yone Noguchi is very much a kind of complementary figure to her, as I say. He does the opposite journey. He comes from Japan to the West, mostly in America, but Europe as well, England as well. And he writes about Japanese poetry. He writes about Japanese art. He's a kind of interesting and slightly weird figure in many ways. He's a very interesting figure. He becomes a friend also of Ezra Pound, actually. By and by, he's friends with lots of important people in the English poetic words, and what I'm quoting from here is a very important little essay, and when I say little essay, it is really very short. It's just one page, entitled "A Proposal to American Poets." And again, I'm looking at my notes, but I think the essay is from 1904. But anyway, no. It's from 1914. So the same time as that collection of repurposed poetry that I've kind of quoted from before. So he writes this essay, as I say, a proposal to American poets, so addressed to the Americans, which he gives a definition of haiku. Haiku and hokku is the same thing, more or less. Hokku, or 17-syllable poem, is like a tiny star, mind you, carrying the whole sky at its back. It is like a slightly open door where you may steal into the realm of poesy. It is simply a guiding lamp. Its value depends on how much it suggests. The hokku poet's chief aim is to impress the reader with the high atmosphere in which he is living. I always compare an English poem with a mansion with windows, widely open, even the pictures of its drawing room being visible from the outside. I dare say it does not tempt me to see the within. Right? So architectural metaphor, visual metaphor at the same time, very poetic, slightly elusive way of kind of explaining. So it's like a tiny star, etc. Blah, 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 blah. It's typical of Noguchi. He has got very kind of, let's say, poetic, very, very abstract writer in many ways. Interesting here, while English poetry is associated with light, kind of the lit windows of a house, Japanese poetry is associated with obscurity, something that kind of is difficult to see. And the house is, of course, an invitation to come in. So there's a whole question of hospitality there, and the invitation, you could say, of exploring Japanese culture, right? The hokku, what does he say? It's a slightly open door. Interesting image, I think, if you're interested of cultural exchange or cultural mediation. So not an open door, but a slightly open door. So an important sense of kind of both of inviting you, but at the same time of not letting you properly in, right? That's what he's talking about. And then he follows with examples of haiku in his own English translations. Oh, the other thing that's important of Noguchi, I should say, is that he is also a poet in English. So he writes English haiku, and he's the first one to have extensively written haiku in English. And so these are his own English haiku. So Noguchi is bilingual, but he's kind of a foreign speaker of English, right? So that's interesting that he's kind of writing through a kind of foreign language, you could say. My girl's lengthy hair swung over me from heaven's gate, lo, evening's shadow. And I think this is swung over me from heaven's gate. Yeah, it's 575. So yeah, so he's kind of obviously thinking that, that's an important thing to preserve, right? Underneath, lo, light and shadow, journey to the home of night, thou and I to love, right? So again, where the flowers sleep, thank God I shall sleep tonight. Oh, come butterfly. Fallen leaves, nay, spirits, shall I go downwards with the longest stream of fate? again. No, they got their own flavor, I would say. They you can tell that they're not Japanese, but at the same time, they're not English poems either. They got a very kind of hybrid, interesting quality, I think, to them, Noguchi's poems. So in 1912, so 2 years before haiku, kind of Hearn's the imagist anthology of Hearn that I showed you before, Noguchi published another important essay entitled "What is a Hokku poem?" Hokku is the same as a haiku, as I say. What is a Hokku poem? In which he gives a very Hearnian, if you want, orientalizing definition of the haiku that evokes insects and ghosts. So he says, hokku is like a spider thread laden with the white summer dews, swaying amongst the branches of a tree like an often invisible ghost in air on the perfect balance. That sway, indeed, not the thread itself, is the beauty of the 17-syllable poem. I really like this one, actually, because it's about it's about a spider web, and says to define haiku is like the movement of a spider web. Really kind of imaginative, right? Obviously kind of not very precise, but very interesting. And this brief article also includes what is normally cited as the first haiku to be written in the English language, right? Which is his own haiku, which he says was inspired by a painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, so a symbolist, kind of English pre-Raphaelite poet. He says one day he was in London, he went to the Tate Gallery, then he went for a walk and blah. He got inspired to write this haiku, which is, "My love's lengthened hair swings over me from heaven's gate, lo, evening's shadow," which is the one I quoted before from the other essay. Interesting that the first haiku in English, if we believe this definition, is also inspired by a painting. So again, kind of visual verbal, except that this is an English painting. So an English painting kind of is inspiring the first haiku in the language. Let me look at this clock. Okay. Noguchi went back, so he kind of came back to the haiku several times, obviously in the course of his career. So his career also coincides with this moment where people start getting interested in haiku because of Ezra Pound, etc. And Noguchi is obviously a very big influence in this story. And in this slightly later essay called "The Spirit of Japanese Poetry," which is a lovely essay, he writes the following. I admit, he writes, that haiku will appear first at once to you to be the vagrant utterances of a primitive man who, uneducated, sings of whatever his fancy or whim finds fair and striking. But I should like to ask, what poet is not primitive in heart when he is true? The real poet, in the Japanese understanding, is primitive, as primitive are the moon and flowers. So, as I say, this is a very interesting essay. If you're interested in haiku, go and read this essay because it's very kind of it's very kind of full, as it were, in what it does. I don't have time to kind of talk about it here, but what I want to stress is just a couple of characteristics which are very important, I think. The first is the connection with mysticism and pantheism. This kind of mystical stuff about kind of haiku is something that has stuck a lot in the English understanding of what haiku is, which again is not something, it's kind of something that is characteristic, I would say, of the European reception rather than of the Japanese original, which is very heavily focused on material stuff, right? Kind of understanding of something that you can describe. And so this idea of the vagrant utterances of a primitive man who finds of whatever his fancy or whim finds fair and striking. He's linking it in a way to animism, to all these ideas of finding kind of a superior meaning in nature, like the idea, for example, that some trees have got spirits in them, that kind of stuff. Is what he's kind of hinting at. And the second one is that in this essay, which, as I say, I'm not going to go into, this essay on the spirit of Japanese poetry, what he does is kind of compares a lot of Western poets to haiku poets. So he compares William Blake, Walter Pater, Robert Browning, and especially Walt Whitman to haiku, in which he says, actually, haiku is not something as foreign as you think, because if you look at Whitman, he writes in a way that's very similar to haiku poetry. So he kind of does the opposite, right? So Western critics were so invested in saying haiku is untranslatable, haiku is different, right? What is kind of beautiful in it is difficult to render, etc. What he does, he says, actually, haiku is already there in the Western tradition. It's not something that's so weirdly Japanese, right? Look at Blake. This bit of Blake is really like a haiku, right? He kind of finds it in the Western tradition. So he's kind of, doing another type of bridging, if you will. When it came to translation, yes, please, you must. Yes. 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 Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I totally understand. I totally agree with you. I think that when he talks about primitivism, he is interested in two things. In, first of all, an anthropological discourse, right? So as we know, within the kind of broader field of studying Asia, etc., at the time, anthropology was very important, right? There was a lot of anthropological stuff, and so he's using a buzzword, if you will, of anthropology. Obviously, it's a word that's loaded with kind of racialized and hierarchical significance, right? It's to do also with kind of establishing a hierarchy of which the West comes out on the top, right? So this is kind of, this is kind of modern and that's primitive, right? And so in a way, he's also kind of inverting that kind of primitive and non-primitive thing, because he's saying the real poet in Japanese understanding is primitive as the moon and the flowers. Noguchi is complicated. So critics of him often point out that he's interiorizing a type of Orientalism and kind of uses it almost as a kind of marketing device. So he makes himself sound what people think the Japanese would sound like, and so he makes himself attractive by voicing that, right? So that's certainly a criticism that you can make towards Noguchi, I would say. Yeah. Yes. Great. Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. This kind of anthropological understanding. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah. Let me, so as I say, when it came to translation, Noguchi was mostly reluctant to give translations of haiku. So he translated actually very few of them. What he preferred is to write his own. So he wrote his own haiku in English rather than give a translation of existing Japanese one. However, like Hearn, whom he knew well, so they never met, but Noguchi actually will write a book about Hearn and go and interview Hearn's wife in Japan, etc., etc. So, like Hearn, he advocated a foreignizing style that would preserve the starkness of the original. He wanted them to kind of sound weird, sound different from what English poetry sounded like, and that indeed would become the kind of phase of haiku in world literature, right? Normally nowadays translations of haiku into kind of contemporary English, also in other languages, keep that very simple kind of and unadorned kind of poetic diction. In the spirit of poetry, he compares different translations of the Morning Glory haiku that I talked about before, about the same poet. So we're coming back one last time to Chigo, right? The same female ancient Japanese poet. And so I've given you three just to give you another flavor of the kind of very different possibilities of translation and what they sound like. The first one is a translation by Edwin Arnold. You will remember Edwin Arnold is the one who collected that anthology of Japanese poetry together with Persian, all sorts of mixed up stuff. I mean, I'm being a little bit rude to him, but he was actually very important. So, quote, "The morning glory, her leaves and bells has bound my bucket handle round. I could not break the bands of these soft hands. The bucket and the well to her left, let me some water, for I come bereft." Now, I actually don't think that this is a bad poem, but it's very distant from what haiku, like it's so long, it's really extended, but it gives you, it wants you to explain, what happens. It also has a voice of someone else, like, it's busy, it's a lot of stuff going on. Clara Walsh, our friend, our mysterious friend from before. All round the rope, a morning glory clings. How can I break its beauty's dainty spell? I beg for water from a neighbor's well. Yes, I like this too. I think she's good. And then finally, Noguchi. The well bucket taken away by the morning glory. Alas, water to beg. Right? Super kind of stark, etc. However, I think it's kind of easy to say that the first two are kind of a little bit baroque and whatever. But if you only read the last, it is very mysterious. I mean, it's really difficult to know what's going on, right? In a way, you get it after reading the other ones. Anyway, so different styles. So to conclude, the work of Lafcadio Hearn and Yone Noguchi, so our two main translators, shows that the invention of the haiku in English at the turn of the 20th century was a transnational affair. Just like Japanese critics were busy repurposing and reinventing the haiku for a new generation of Japanese readers who were trained in Western as well as Japanese literature and who lived in a very modernizing and changing landscape of modern Japan, foreign critics were also busy trying to make the haiku into a global kind of genre, right? No longer a domestic genre, but something that could be adapted into other languages, including English. In order to do that, they also associated it with the visual culture of Japanese and all the kind of, the knowledge of Japan that had generated. These pioneering mediators operated in a fluid landscape as they work to endow the short form with new meanings and to adapt it to the Anglophone poetic tradition. Hearn interpreted the haiku in relation to visual and material culture, remember the toothpicks and the chopsticks and all sorts of stuff like that, and associated it with insects like fireflies and cicadas. You can see he's doing this kind of, as I said before, anthropological, cultural work of kind of writing the haiku in this kind of rich material culture. I'm willing to detach the haiku from the embodied and lived contexts of its production. So production, he hid hundreds of haiku transliterations and translations in his essays, in the jumble, you could say, of his Japanese writings, which makes them largely invisible. By contrast, Noguchi seized on the haiku to construct his own persona as cultural mediator. You could say he's kind of creating his own value through this poetic tradition, turning it into a sort of brand of the Japanese spirit, which of course he was meant to embody. His approach, Noguchi's approach, was altogether more high cultural and abstract than Hearn's folkloristic, you could almost say, one. So Hearn is interested in people who kind of, pick up, dragonflies. Noguchi is talking about the sway of the spider web. So very, very different thing. This is why Noguchi's writings caught the attention of Ezra Pound, who projected the haiku into canonical English or Anglo-English, Anglophone or Anglo-American modernism, which in turn acted as a vector for the widening of the global reception of the haiku into other languages as well. The modernist invention of the haiku or reinvention of the haiku was, however, only one of the many possibilities, of course, that this traditional form could have taken. And I leave you just with two more examples that I'm not going to comment, but just shows, which are from a 1925 American children's book written by somebody called Olive Beaupre Miller and illustrated by Catherine Sturgis. So a collaboration between two women. As they wrote in their opening note to Little Pictures from Japan, this is what it was called, the two authors took inspiration from some of the names that I have mentioned today, Hearn and Noguchi, but also translators Curtis Page and Clara Walsh. In their short preface, they describe haiku as, quote, the tiniest poem in the world, and as dewdrops and gems, metaphors that, of course, invite the power to magnify, right? The gem, the metaphor, something that's small and big at the same time. Like, you know, kind of you look through it, you see the world differently, as it were. Importantly, they imagine the haiku as a genre that is particularly well suited for children. Cricket, butterfly, bees, frogs, stars, flowers, winds, they write. These were the things of which the Japanese poets sang. What could be more simple or within the understanding of the smallest child? This is what they write. And this is the kind of book that they produce. Again, kind of in dialogue with pictorial art, etc., but aimed at children. And these are the same translations. These are translations by Hearn, by Noguchi. So they're not making their own translation. They're just repurposing them as a children's genre. Right? You know, so completely different from the kind of abstract, high cultural kind of work of the male modernists, right? So this is kind of family friendly, as you were, haiku, as you can see from the illustrations there. So this is all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening. Please, if there are any questions, fire away.
Thank you so much. I think we need actually more time for your lecture. It was a very, very inspiring, interesting lecture. I want to show you this cover.
Oh, wow, yes.
This is the cover of the collection of Korean poetry. I had the opportunity to translate. So because it reminds the cover you showed before.
Much. That's right, exactly.
Yeah, this is Azalea. Yeah, this is Azalea, not. Okay, so actually we have a few minutes, 7-8 minutes. For a couple of, okay.
And in English or Italian, of course, you know, we can switch.
Thank you so much. It was really a beautiful lecture. And actually, I would like to make an observation and then a question. I was thinking about, of course, all the flow of Orientalism and actually Japanese and chinoiserie in Victorian England. Yes. Had such an influence, but they, of course, were a form of appropriation, of colonization, of course, but also maybe a way of exploring something that wasn't allowed to be expressed. Yeah. So it was very interesting about the metaphors which Hearn made, I think, about poems written on the underwear, written on fans and curtains, screens. So something, many things that hide. And also the metaphor of the Japanese collar, of course, about the just a slightly open door. So something, it was a kind, of course, of necessity of this society, I think, as far as I understand. And so this is very interesting. And then there are many consequences, of course, in this kind of appropriation. This is an example, of course, of complete, of course, children can enjoy poetry, but this does not mean that haiku is for children, because it expresses really a very, very deep philosophical point of view on nature, on relationship between nature and human beings and so on. So it is very interesting. And then I would like to ask about whether these authors were interested also in the visual part of Japanese script, because when they say, or Hearn said, poetry should be seen by the eye, I think it's not only the relation with, of course, with painting and the tradition of painting, but also with characters. And so I would like to ask about, because it's interesting, of course, there were many printing hindrances at the time. It was difficult to print Japanese characters, but maybe they made some observation about this. And then another question I found very, very interesting, the insertion of punctuation,
Punctuation, yes.
also in the transcriptions, because of course Japanese didn't have it.
No, that's right.
And so it was very interesting to add, even Hearn, who was so faithful, he felt the need to add punctuation. So this is very interesting, I think. Thank you very much. It was beautiful.
Thank you. No, thank you for these questions. I mean, it's lovely questions and a lot of stuff. I'm probably not going to remember them all as I answer. So please kind of prompt me if I skip something important, as I undoubtedly would. I mean, to start from the last one, punctuation. It's also something, actually, when I was reading this material, it took me a little while to understand that punctuation was important. And kind of when I started looking at it, I just started to understand just how much the translators have to pack. So they have to pack a lot. And if they want to reduce, they start increasing the punctuation, because the punctuation does the work that words don't do. So they put more signs, right? And they put a lot of signs on the file. So dashes are typical. Dashes are typical because dash is an ambiguous punctuation sign, I suppose, because it's something that breaks and connects at the same time. Right, so kind of Hearn really goes for the dashes, but exclamation marks is another thing again, because that kind of creates the sense of kind of the caesura, of the kind of where the caesura is. Again, it's obviously more difficult to do without punctuation, right? Because the caesura has to be expressed through the image, not through the sign, if you will, right? So that's the one. But the question of the Japanese and Chinese script really is super important. Hearn writes about Chinese characters many times, and he writes about the appeal of Chinese character, and he tries to explain the idea of what it means to see a Chinese character and kind of decipher it in a way. He writes about the complicated stuff of learning kind of Chinese characters for children, etc. So he kind of really insists on that. The other thing that is important about Hearn is that his Japanese wasn't very good, in fact. So that, as I say, he always needed to rely on someone else to translate Japanese for him, right? Kind of say his wife, his students. These were the more typical people that he wrote. So his translations are kind of, being they're collaborative. And so in a way, the genres that he's choosing to translate are genres that kind of are easier for him to translate. So he kind of openly also says, I'm not going to translate classical Japanese poetry ever because it's too difficult for me. Like, I don't understand it. Fine. Ghost stories, okay, because they often were orally recounted to him, so he could kind of collaborate with somebody orally and kind of write it down and whatever. Haiku are normally written in kind of not in Chinese characters, but in kind of Japanese hiragana, so syllable, because of the counting of syllables, right? So that's also something that is a little bit easier for the transliteration and stuff like that. But Hearn was very insistent that the sound should be kept on the page. So he wanted people to hear, right? However impossible that is, if you look at the script. I mean, how many people would have even a faintest idea in 19th century England or America what Japanese might have sounded like? Even looking at the... But obviously, he was very kind of keen on that. His editors, his magazine editors especially, didn't want that, and they often asked him to get rid of it, but he was very insistent that he wanted to be kept, etc. I expect that even he thought that characters he could not possibly include, because most of this stuff was actually first printed in magazines, and those I think would have found it almost impossible to be able to kind of technologically, right, to include characters. But I have no doubt that he would have been incredibly interested in engaging with that, because, as he says, because when he talks about kind of the Chinese script, he often thinks about kind of painterly analogies there. So, for example, he writes about how, there's so much more of individual character that can be expressed by Japanese people writing Chinese script, because, say, where the brush is deep and where it's light might show different types of emotions and, all this kind of stuff, right? So he's very kind of engaged in the technology of the Chinese character and what that might mean. So yeah, so thank you for that. That's very important. And then yes, absolutely, to the idea that the kind of both to the kind of overlap with the kind of discourse of chinoiserie, etc., and interest in China in the 19th century, but also with the whole kind of sense of cultural appropriation, right, of these countries. Again, what's very striking to me is that often the names of the authors are actually omitted from some of these translations, right? This classic Japanese poem, we're told, but not the name of who wrote that, right? Something that you would never do if you were translating, say, the so-called Italian primitives, which were very popular in late 19th century England, translated by Rossetti. You always have an author. You can, the idea that, but here, this introduction of this poetry kind of decoupled by the idea of authorship and possession often, which is obviously a sense in which even these authors are trying to bridge a gap. They're very committed. They love, this material. They still have this attitude of devaluing it in many ways, right? Which is very striking. Yeah. Mm. That's okay. Thank you very much. Yes.